So I want to start by talking about brain regulation, and unfortunately, it's not it's not this simplistic. A lot of people, however, have heard in the popular media about like depression being a biochemical imbalance or something like that, and there's a real temptation to look at it in a simplistic kind of fashion. But the truth is, there's just a huge number of things that are required for normal brain functioning. And so as we start looking at some of this, then keep in mind there are some endogenous factors. Okay, the brain and the body regulates itself, but also this is true for all really all animals. But we'll just talk mainly about mammals. Is having to have certain specific environmental experiences in order to regulate normal brain functioning. And I'll be giving you a bunch of examples here in just a couple of minutes of what I mean. So we're going to first look at this from an evolutionary perspective, and if you believe the most current theories about the origins of the human species, it probably dates back to 5 million years ago in equatorial Africa. And the relevance of this is this: any living creature, could be an animal, could be plant, over the millennia, through processes of natural selection, will develop physiology that is in sync with their particular ecological niche. What I mean by being in sync, the physiology that optimizes survival and adaptation. And this happens for every single organism on this planet. There are two things that are very unique about the equator. Singular experience compared to every other part of the world. The first is you get 365 days of light, of sunlight. There are virtually no differences from season to season at the equator. Okay? And we're going to see that light is a very potent environmental stimulus. It has a huge impact on the brain. The other is that the sun comes up at the same time each day. And actually, it's 15 minutes between one part of the year and 6 months later, but it's really irrelevant. Okay, but how this is important is we're going to see that the time of your first dose of light is the way that mammals regulate their internal circadian rhythm. Okay, and so there was this enormous regularity. You didn't have any choice. Every single day, you probably got 12 hours of bright sunlight, and every day the sun came up at the same time. And so what I would suggest is that it's not only that these early hominids, in a sense, got used to this, but I would say they came to rely on these very regular and predictable environmental stimuli. Now, the theory continues to be some debate about this, but it looks like there's a lot of migration outside of Africa numerous times in the past 5 million years. And these early humans, they migrated to parts of Asia, they migrated to Europe, but it looks like in every single case, when they kind of set up their new living arrangements, they became extinct until about 140,000 years ago. And that's when there was migration outside of equatorial Africa, and people began to survive and thrive. Okay. Now, what this really means, the reason I'm saying this, is that if you look at this 5 million years of development of our physiology, our brain, 140,000 years is a drop in the bucket. And so in a very real sense, we have equatorial brains that continue to function best if they have lots of bright sunlight and you're awakened at the same time each day by a dose of light. Hang on just a minute. Get a drink here. Okay. Another factor, too, is that, according to the best theories, about 11,000 years ago, there was the development of agriculture, and division of labor became a possibility at that point. Prior to that, and this is pretty well supported, every person on Earth was a hunter-gatherer. And what that really meant is that they had to survive in the environment where they were living. And it turns out that in equatorial Africa, this is a savanna. And it's much harder for hunter-gatherers to actually stay alive in that setting than in a rainforest. Like back in the 1930s, Margaret Mead and some other anthropologists went to New Guinea and Borneo and saw some primitive people living there that really were true hunter-gatherers, but they're in the rainforest and they're next to rivers and the abundance of fish and that sort of thing. So you could get by with maybe spending an hour or two each day collecting food, hunting, and that kind of stuff. But that's not at all what it's like in the savannah. Okay, and it's been estimated that in the savannah, in order for everybody just to get enough food to live, it required every single person in this small community. And by the way, they think the communities were about like groups of 20 or 30 people. Every single person except really young children and infants or someone that is infirm, everyone had to go out and work their butts off basically to try to stay alive. And it required an enormous amount of physical activity, and the estimate, and this is based on studying, actually there are a couple of hunter-gatherer communities to this day in savanna regions, like in the Kalahari Desert, for instance. And what they've determined is to eke out a living, a survival in that kind of setting requires the amount of physical activity that's on par with walking 10 miles a day. Now, here's why this is important. Obviously, the brain, it initiates motor activity, it directs the muscles, and so forth. But just moving changes the brain. And what was demonstrated about 30 years ago is just moving had a significant impact on the neurotransmitter serotonin. Now, everybody talks about serotonin largely because the drug companies have really played that up. The antidepressants, many of them target serotonin system. But serotonin actually turns out to be a very primitive neurotransmitter, if you will. It's found in almost every single animal, all the way down to coral. And serotonin is necessary in nervous systems. It also plays a very important role in the digestive system. And in fact, in human beings, about 90% of serotonin activity occurs in the intestines. Okay, so this is a neurotransmitter that's very important for a number of reasons, but we're talking mainly about brain functioning now. Okay, so what they found in these studies about 25 to 30 years ago, they put laboratory animals on a treadmill. And they did this with rats and dogs, different species. They put them on a treadmill that was electrified so that it kept running, so they had to walk. They couldn't get off. They didn't have any choice. It had walls on the side, so they couldn't get out of there. They had to walk. And what they did is they sampled their cerebral spinal fluid before and then after they walked 90 minutes, hour and a half. And after an hour and a half, across several different mammalian species, they found that it doubled the level of brain serotonin. Now we're going to get into talking about exercise as a treatment for psychiatric disorders later, and we'll get into more detail. But that's a good example of how simply moving. So these early humans just trying to survive every single day, no ifs, ands, or buts. They had to get out there, and so that the human brain, in a sense, became accustomed to and dependent on quite a lot of movement. And clearly, that is not the way things are these days. Especially in our country, people are very sedentary. More recently, in the last 5 years, they have also discovered that the neurotransmitter dopamine significantly increases even with like 15 to 20 minutes of vigorous exercise. So another neurotransmitter so important for cognition and emotional functioning and so forth. So let's take a look at this. This is probably my only original contribution to psychology, so I hope that you like this. What I did is I got out my calculator and took a look at this human evolution theory, 5 million years, and tried to represent it as a one-year calendar, kind of have perspective on it. So you can see here, January 1st, first hominids. Homo erectus was not until August the 23rd. Fire was first used November 27th, so very late in the game. Now, what's the implication of that? Nobody knows. This is just speculation. But it's very likely that when it was dark, unless you had a full moon, people couldn't see anything. And they probably slept. And they probably slept a lot more than people are accustomed to today. But again, that's just complete conjecture. But one thing is known, there was a study that was done in 1904. They took a random sample of American citizens and determined how many hours of sleep they averaged, per day, per week, per month. And then they basically repeated the study in 2004 4. So we're looking at 100 years difference, and comparing the amount of time people slept in 1904 to 2004, currently Americans are sleeping on average 1.5 hours less per night than they did 100 years ago. And of course, why? Well, because people want to stay up, right? They want to do stuff. They want to watch movies and get on the computer and work and play and study and all that kind of stuff. And as we're going to see, this is a theme that it's kind of obvious to say this, but how far can you stretch things? How little amount of sleep can you really get before it starts to backfire? How much decreased light exposure really ultimately backfires? Okay, so anyway, November 27th. Now, December 22nd, in this 5 million years, okay, the first migration outside of Africa was without extinction. And then the last day of the year, 7 a.m., agriculture is discovered. Okay, so up until that point, every single person on the planet was a hunter-gatherer. And then December the 31st at 11:58 p.m., okay, milestones in human evolution, Prozac is discovered. Okay, so there you go. Thank goodness for drug, better living by chemistry. Okay, so put it in a different perspective, you can see what the slide says here about the amount of time in equatorial Africa and so forth. A large chunk of our history, we were waking up at the same time each day, getting lots of bright light, moving around and so forth. On second thought, you hunt and I'll gather. Okay.